The morning of the 27th dawns. The mayor has called a press conference for, I want to say 11:30. And it was to announce the new supervisor from District 9, or 8, I think it was 9. Yes, and word was leaking out. It was a fellow named Don Haranzi, I didn't know, and so my camera crew and I were assigned to cover the mayor's press conference at 11:30 and do a live shot on the new news. So we brought there was going to be a live truck involved, except something had happened. One of our trucks had broken down, and my crew was in a loaner van. And I said, hey, we got a little time. Let's whiz out to Dan White's house, and I want to interview him. I want to get a pre-reaction, because I don't know if any other reporters even knew where Dan White's house was. So I figured I'll just go out there blind and say something. I didn't want to call him because that might, be a problem. So they said, okay, we'll do that. We got in the van and we start to drive. One of the guys says, we're going to need a mic stand, for the mayor's press conference. And, we don't have it. We have to go over to the garage where our van is being repaired and get it out of the van, which was in the other direction. It wasn't far, but it was, it was a time thing. And I've thought about this a million times. Did I just really not want to do my job as a reporter and confront Dan White and say, what were you thinking? I mean, get some kind of newsy thing? Or was I just being too what's the right word, gracious to my cohorts who should have had the mic stand with them? And in retrospect, what a stupid thing to need, because it was clearly going to be at a podium and they could have gaffer taped the thing to the podium. I mean, it was really a ridiculous kind of thing. But we didn't go, is the long story. And at that moment, as we found out later, Dan White was in his house loading up his weapons and getting ready to go to City Hall. I mean, if I had gone down there, I might have intercepted him. I might have seen him. I might have been able to talk to him. Obviously, I would have never anticipated what could have happened. I honestly don't believe that if I had walked into his garage and he was loading his gun or something like that, anything that he would have turned the gun on me. I just don't believe that. Yeah. But I will never be able to stop wondering, what if? What if? But I didn't. And so we went back to City Hall, we set up, went out and got the thing, went back to City Hall. And the timing, it may have been he was already on his way to City Hall. I may have missed him. I may have missed everything that we ended up being able to cover. So, you'll never know the answer to this. But it all happened, again, in a very compressed time frame in that morning. And when we finally got around to going over to City Hall, because we didn't have enough time to go out to his house then, we get, as we're pulling up, we're half a block from City Hall, we get the police call, the active shooter in City Hall, and we just tore out. I jumped out of the car. I said, out of the van, I remember this vividly, it was on the Larkin Street side. It's a block from the entrance on Polk. And I told the guys, I said, pull your van into here, call them and I said, call the station, get a live truck here now, and I'm going in. And so I ran in without the camera crew, and they followed me. And as I got up there, it was a maelstrom. Police, everybody were kind of milling around in that area outside the Board of Supervisors chambers, and the offices in City Hall go all the way around that floor, the supervisors' offices. And then the mayor's office is at the other end, the Polk Street end. So as I ran in, I ran up the ceremonial steps to get to the supervisors' thing, area, because that's where all the people I saw clumped as I ran in. And as I got up there, I saw a young woman named Denise Apcar, who was Dan White's legislative assistant, who I guess was still, holding the office open, even though Dan wasn't there anymore. And I said, Denise, what are you doing here? What's going on? She said, I don't know. Have you seen Dan? And I said, what do you mean have I seen Dan? And she said, well, he was just here, and he came and he ran into me, and he said, in my office, and he said, I need your car keys, and I need them now. And he grabbed my car keys and rushed out. I'm trying to find him. And I said, Dan White was here. Yeah, he was just here. And she clearly did not put all this together. And I did. And again, this is probably trying to protect somebody instead of just being, a grabby news person. What, the journalist would have said. I remember I didn't have a camera here. I didn't have a camera with me.
What was your initial thinking of what may have went on?
Well, I mean, I thought, there were. I'm trying to recall whether we knew at that moment, because Diane had not come out to announce this yet. And I did not. I can't tell you with certainty today that I knew. I knew there had been shootings. I didn't know that it was the mayor and Harvey Milk at the time, as far as I can recall today. I mean, I would have to, reprogram my brain to know exactly what the sequence is of my cognition. But I think there were, I think there were buzzing about that in the hallways. And she came, and I said, okay. What did I say? Oh, I know. I took her, the police chief, who I believe at the time was Charlie Gain, remember Charlie Gain was the police chief that they brought in from out of town, and he was the guy that painted all the police cars baby blue. Anyway, Charlie Gain was there, and I took Denise. I said, as a journalist, I probably should have said, would you come with me outside, please, where the camera was. What I did instead was I said, you need to talk to Chief Gain right now. And I took her over to the chief, and I said, Chief, you need to hear what she says. And I sort of forfeited what would have been, big exclusive, but at that time I thought what was really important was getting the information to the police as fast as possible. But I did know what I knew, and so I went downstairs. And I ran back downstairs because a camera crew at that point had come up. And I said, is the live truck down there? And they said, yes. And so I ran back downstairs. They were setting up, and pretty soon I was on the air. I mean, I beat everybody else on the air, which was important. While I was running downstairs, the camera, Diane emerged and gave what is now that very famous video clip, which I only saw on video because I went down to do the live shot. And, then we knew it was Dan White, and, I was able to report live on the air that I knew that he had been at City Hall, that his assistant had said he'd been at City Hall, and, so then we talked about it. And in the course of doing the live shot, I felt an obligation to disclose that I knew Dan White socially, and that made it much more of the moment. Yes, it was not just Dan White, but as I've said before, it was knowing all three principles. I mean, I don't know that there are that many news events where a journalist knew both the victims and the killer.
Of course, the Ferry Building is a real civic monument, you know, and it was at one time the second biggest passenger terminal in the world, Charing Cross being number one, which is astounding, you know, for this little city, you know, and architecturally, you know, this tower at the end of Market Street. I mean, we have these two diagonal streets in the city, and Market and Columbus, you know, and Columbus ends at the Transamerica Pyramid, if you're going in the right direction. Otherwise, it's in your rearview mirror. And, you know, the whole main street, Market Street of San Francisco, focused on the Ferry Building. The other end at Castro Street ends in a whimper at a gas station, but Bernard Maybach did a plan for like a Greek temple at the top of the hill and a water cascade, you know, coming down the hill, you know, forming the other end of this iconic boulevard. And the way the Ferry Building operated was that passengers came on and off at an upper level, came into the upper level concourse of the building. There was then a bridge over the Embarcadero and passenger bridge and down into the street. And luggage and freight was handled on the ground floor. So the ground floor is low ceiling, mean kind of space, because it was made for freight, not for people. And the death knell for the Ferry Building, of course, was the building of the bridges in 37 and 38, and then the Key System Railway, you know, so the ferry business dried up very quickly. And, you know, the port did a bad remodel in the 1950s. The port offices, they put a mezzanine in to create a third floor, so this great two-story nave, you know, was cut in half, and there was this funky third floor upstairs where the port offices were, and then there were other not very nice offices throughout the building because it's not the right shape particularly, you know, for windowed office space. And, you know, so Spur was continually urging its remodel, and there were these, you know, developers, you know, coming and going, and nobody could get the financing to do it until the Embarcadero came down. And so the earthquake was in October of '89. In 2001, the port came out with an RFP for developer architect teams. Developer architect finance package teams is the way these things work these days. And you know, and the usual protests were heard from people who said, well, we've got to save this for the ferries. You know, well, we've all been working on getting more ferries for a long time. We are getting more ferries, but there's never going to be the passenger load to support a building that large and to support the rehabilitation of the building. There are a series of beautiful ferry terminals first north, and they're about to go under construction. Additional ones to the south that are outside ferry terminals, which is what we use today, and the commercial takes place within the Ferry Building. We're not providing waiting rooms. And so I had to do, you know, a lot of public education about the port and the possibility of this project. The development model for the Ferry Building was Pike Place Market in Seattle, which, of course, is this wonderful food market that was built in 1907. And I must say, I was skeptical that this could be recreated and be able to amortize a very expensive historic remodel project. And the leasing was done by Michelle Meany, married to Chris Meany, partner in Wilson Meany, Sullivan developer. And, you know, they said, local businesses only, no chains. You know, this is not going to be Pier 39. It's not going to be Fisherman's Wharf. You know, this is going to be a local community resource. And boy, were they right, you know. My attitude on touristic things is that you shouldn't build anything for tourists. You should build it for San Franciscans. And if San Franciscans like it, tourists will love it, you know? And that's what they've done. I mean, the Ferry Building is a social event every Saturday, you know? That it is in the farmers market outside, you know, an educational farmers market. And, you know, there are 100 small businesses in the Ferry Building. I've done some work with the Ferry Building in the last few years, and it's a tough thing to manage because there's 100 small businesses, most of whom have never been in business before, you know, that this is their first retail outlet, and it's a very personal management challenge. But why does the public love it? When they first were leasing it, they had to practically give away the office space. You know, when the leases came up, you know, they were able to. They're now doing great. You know, and what a place to have an office. The port hearing room is on the second floor looking out at the bay, and it's also the BCDC hearing room. And it is so great. I mean, I was at the BCDC meeting last week or the week before when it was Fleet Week, and, you know, what a show, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
The days that I got the Pentagon Papers, probably the most intense and continuous events that I've had. I think I was 2 or 3 days without sleep, and things were happening all the time, and changed radically from almost hour by hour, but came out finally the way I think it should have come out. Well, it was certainly a hostile time dealing with the Nixon administration, but also it was dealing with what had been classified as very secret material, which the New York Times, which we regarded as our competitor, had already received copies of them, and we knew they had something. We didn't know what it was. They had, and neither did most of the New York Times staff. The Times had established, away from the newsroom, a special kind of secret, self-contained group to deal with something. The Times people didn't know what it was, the regular staff, but we knew that because we knew so many people at the Times, that something very hot and secret was involved. And when I made my call from Bill Anderson's apartment, and my deputy said, the Times is printing the secret papers from the Pentagon about Vietnam. So I immediately knew we were going to have to do something. And first thing I saw, when I saw Bradley the next day, I said, we've got to report what the Times are saying. He hated to do that. I said, I know, but this is big national news. We've got to say the New York Times reported today that they had papers that said thus and so. He hated it. He hated that, but he realized that as a obligation to our audience, we had to say that. And so we ran our lead story, the New York Times today, printed papers from the documents, the secret papers from the Vietnam War. And we did that. And then the Times was enjoined by the district court in New York from printing any more. And they appealed. And so after they were stopped, I came out of one of our afternoon press conferences. My deputy, very cool character, said, here's something you ought to look at. And it had been a message that came in during the news conference. Call Mr. Boston at this number. And I noticed that the area code was 617, and that is Boston. And I said, someone call Mr. Boston in Boston? Something is funny here. But it says, call from a secure phone. So I went across the street, and the Statler Hotel at that time had a bank of telephone booths, public phones. And I called that number, and that someone answered and said, are you at a secure phone? I said, yes. I said, all right, now here's a number. Go to another secure phone and call this number. So I called that number, and it was Dan Ellsberg. Dan said, I took a cab and asked the cab driver to find the number of the house. It was a very dark street, and he had to light a match to see the street number. It was there, and a woman opened the door and said, I said, I've been told that there's something here that I should pick up. She said, who sent you? I said, a friend of mine and a friend of yours. And she said, okay, I'll go get it. She brought up a box, a very heavy box. It was about 3 feet long and a foot wide. It was the old Xerox boxes which carried folded papers, blank papers. And I asked the cab driver to put it in a cab because I have a back that goes out every now and then. And we drove back. When I came back, Dan was just coming to this room. He found out what room I was in, and he looked terrible. He had a headache, and he said, do you have any aspirin? And they got some aspirin at the desk, and he took it, and then had the box. He says, where's the other box? I said, what other box? He said, there were 2 boxes. And I said, well, you didn't say that, or nobody told me that. And I said, he said, we're going to have to go through all of these things. I said, then we better send somebody to get that. So they found somebody who didn't know what was going on, but knew they had to take a taxi to go to a certain address. And then the second box arrived, and we opened the door just enough for this kid to push the box in. So there were 2 big boxes. And by this time, we began spreading the papers on the bed. And Dan said, now, we got to separate these out. I said, yes, we have to separate these out in terms of stories, not chronological, but the ones that are most important first. And he said, well, we've got to cut off the code numbers of these cables, because these are copies of top secret cables with a code. And if you print the code publicly, a hostile nation can take that code number, look at what will be printed as a plain language, and figure out the code. He said, the difference for me, he said, is 10 years or life imprisonment. So as we began cutting out the codes,
Literally, you were cutting them off. It's not that you
literally with a pair of scissors,